Hey, welcome to another live Facebook writing question discussion stream thing. I'm Bryan Young. Presumably, you know that if you're watching this, or if you don't, and you're just stumbling upon this. Um, I hope this convinces you to check out other stuff. So we've got a couple of questions, and yes, I have some new glasses. Um, so the first question for this time is, how much work do I put into a book before I start it? Um, and that's kind of a big question, but it's also dependent on the book. It depends on how I'm writing the book. Um, with the last book I wrote, The Aeronaut, I put in a lot of work and a lot of research, and it was something that I'd plotted the story out and created an outline for how I wanted it to work. And although it didn't always work out that way specifically, the outline was there so I could rely on it and know what the major story beats were. But because it was set in a steampunk World War One sort of setting, I needed to do the research on World War One, and so I went through and I read a whole lot of newspapers from the era, which gave me a lot of ideas about how what sort of products were being used or talked about. You know, one thing I found was that reading the newspapers from the era in the 19 teens, toothpaste wasn't as much of a thing, but they were advertising tooth powder, which is something that kind of sent me down a researching rabbit hole. And so there are little details like that that you're able to work in that work well for the story. But in researching World War One specifically, I wanted it to make it feel very steampunk. And so I was like, well, I'm going to use zeppelins, and I'm going to use stuff like this, and here's what the aesthetic is going to be. And then I found out that my idea of a steampunk World War One was pretty much what World War One was already like. So I had to go do research to find out how I could amplify that even further. But on the other hand, the book I wrote right after The Aeronaut was called The Mercurius, and it's something I'm querying out now. And I decided to try to write it after I read Stephen King's On Writing. And his method for writing is very much, I'm going to take a premise and an idea for a character, and then I'm not going to outline per se, but I'm going to force the character through these stages of this premise, and just have them react as logically as I can for that character, and then see how the story unfolds from there. And so for that story, all I really did was create the characters and the situation that they were going to be in from the beginning, and that was all the preparation I did. I created the environment, I created the characters, and then the premise, what the major dilemma from the beginning was. And that was a lot of fun because I got to write myself into a corner every time, and then, you know, I'd get my 1,000 words a day done or whatever, and then I wouldn't know what was coming next. And so it created this really interesting excitement for me in the writing, where I was really excited to get to work the next day because I'd spent the whole day previous thinking about what new place I could take it, or how much more absurd I could make it, or how much more threatening the situation could be. So the amount of prep work for a book is different depending on the book and the way you're planning on writing it. And I don't think there's necessarily any wrong way. I personally work with a rough outline from start to finish, and then as I get through, I'll very carefully outline the first third and get through most of the way of that, and then carefully outline the second third just ahead of me, because the story really does take new shapes as I'm writing. As far as world building, again, that depends. The epic fantasy book I'm working on revising now, I spent a lot of time creating the world and developing the mythology and building everything that I needed to create the world. And it was a world I'd originally created for a role-playing game, so I did a lot of work to build it and make it habitable for characters. And then when I realized I wanted to write a story in a fantasy setting, it made a lot of sense for me to go back to that well and use that world to do it, which is, I mean, most fantasies probably based on something close to a role-playing game setting. So hopefully that answers that question. The next question is, how do I get the pace of a story correct? Now, this is something that I learned a bit in screenwriting, right? In screenwriting, there's very hard and fast rules. You want your inciting incident to be by page 10. You want your Act 2 climax to start by this page. This is how long Act 2 needs to be. Act 3 needs to be shorter. And so that progression from start to finish is something that I started learning in screenplays. And you can watch in a movie the pacing and see what's right and what's not right by watching lots and lots of movies. But when you read a book and try to pace it like a movie, you can kind of carry over that feeling both ways. And so it's really it's something that needs to be learned. But I took a class at the League of Utah Writers at a conference, and they'd invited me to come teach a class about diversity, and I got there early and caught a class about pacing. And he had an interesting I forget the name of the teacher off the top of my head, forgive me, but he had a really interesting perspective in that the way you would pace a story was in quarters. So you'd have your like pre-story. These are the things characters are working on, and by that 25% mark of your book, you would need to have the real story pop out, right? So he would actually go through and say, this book is going to be 80,000 words. It needs to be how many chapters? His chapters were about 2,000 words each, or like 1,700 words. So he went through and divided how many chapters he needed, divided those chapters into fourths, and then said, okay, by chapter 11, it turned out to like 40 chapters or something in his example. And by chapter 11, he needed to have the original story that the characters are involved in, almost like that James Bond or Indiana Jones sort of opening. But he was dealing with YA fiction, so it was like, I'm dealing with a bully at school, that sort of stuff. And then the real story needs to present itself so that the Act 1, where a lot of us would normally think of Act 1, starts on that 25% mark. And then he had, like, by 50%, this had to happen. And by 75, by 50%, they needed to think that they needed to be, like, on the road to solving this problem. By 75%, they needed to feel like they'd solved the problem and seen who was behind it, but that would turn out to be false. That would be like a false positive. So that he would... the idea was that they would feel like they had all the pieces put into place, and then going into that last fourth of the story, as long as new information was becoming relevant, so that the characters thought that they had things right, but had really not come to the right conclusions, and they could learn what the real conclusions were. That was that last fourth of the book. And it was interesting, and it's not necessarily the way I would pace a book, but it certainly worked for him, and it certainly turned my ideas. The book that I just finished on Monday, first drafting, I was drafting it. I was about halfway through the draft when I took this class, and he certainly helped me figure out how to work a mystery a little bit more. So I think part of it is that's why it's so important to take classes and stuff like this, and to just learn, because when you're learning and hearing people talking about writing, you're thinking about it in context of your story right then and there, and it helps you solve problems you didn't realize you had, or helps you strengthen the things that might have already been strengths in the first place. But as far as pacing, I would say Reading Robert McKee's story. That's a book you're going to hear me reference a lot. I think, although it's designed for screenwriting, and screenwriting is definitely not prose writing, it will definitely help you get a grasp of pacing. It'll help you get a grasp of story structure in general, too, that I think is universal to all storytelling, not just screenplays or prose or novels or novellas or whatever. It gives you a very good foundation in the basis of storytelling, and so that's something you should definitely check out. But for me, I tend to pace my stories quickly. I tend to end chapters on questions that need answering. Because it makes you want to turn the page, right? You want to end every chapter at that moment where people have an extra bit of information and they go, holy crap, I really need to find out what's going on next. And in some of the bigger stuff I've worked on, like that epic fantasy, you'll end a chapter there with that question people really want the answer to, and then come up with an equally compelling situation with the other characters you've been dealing with, and they get through that because they want to get the answer to the other question, but then they get to the end of that chapter and they're like, well, I need the answer to this question too. And hopefully you just build that up so that part of the pace is just how quick you can make people turn the pages. So I'm not sure that answers that question, like how do you pace a story correctly, but it certainly, I think, kind of approaches that. I think I'd probably need a more specific question than that. If there's any questions in the chat room, you're more than welcome to ask any questions right now before we wrap up. And as we're doing that, I'll say, please, if you're watching this, feel free to check out any of my books. My most recent book is called The Aeronaut. We talked a little bit about it earlier, and I've got a short story collection. If you're into Star Wars, you'll probably really like it. It's very space opera sci-fi. It's called Escape Vector, and it's all short stories, mainly with female protagonists kicking ass in space. So that was a lot of fun to put together. Those both came out last year, and that's what I've got now. Right now I'm working on the whole agent and querying and dealing with publishers thing, which has been a lot of fun trying to navigate those waters, because I've got 3 manuscripts that are out that I'm querying, and a 4th that I'm revising to start querying, and then I've got 3 other manuscripts that are in the queue to start getting revised. I've got 7 manuscripts out that are finished that have not seen the light of day, and I'm just going to keep cycling through them and hoping I can crack the traditional publishing nut in a fashion larger than the small presses that I've been working with. Hoping that it would bring more attention to the small presses that I'd been working on before. So with that, I think that about covers it, unless anybody's got any last minute questions there. I'll end by saying keep writing and spread the word about these as much as you can, and hopefully these are helpful, and if they are, like I said, spread the word. So keep writing, and write me over the next week with any other questions you might have between now and then. So thanks.